We often look up to the stars for answers, but we are suggesting you might look down for a change. We are handing you a terrestrial telescope and inviting you to go ground gazing with us. What do you see? Cropped plants, ink spots of water, open mounds of tufted earth. Dive deeper, there is a world beneath. A festival of exchange, a body that brings balance. Peatlands are rich constellations where we can discover ancient histories, cultural heritage and essential ecosystems. Their wisdom can help us to learn more about the world we live in and how to make it a better place together. Hi and welcome to Wetland, the second episode in a Bogcast series made for Peat-Fest South-West. During the festival, we are celebrating our love for peatlands, spreading knowledge and awareness so that we can look after them together.
In this episode, the sun shines brightly, providing plants with the energy they need to grow and photosynthesize. Plants crawl from the comfort of the ocean, making life on the harsh, heated land. They become numerous, and some waterlogged environments give them life after death, storing their ancient energy and creating a uniquely powerful substance. We will look at water, its essential role in forming peat, the plant life involved, what happens when humans interrupt these processes, and how we can gain the skills to restore them.
So the landscape here is really interesting. It's very flat, as you can imagine, because we're with this sort of wetland area.
When you get out onto the nature reserves that we have here in the Avalon Marshes, we've got wonderful wide open areas of open water, which are really important for the overwintering birds. We've got lots of reed bed areas as well. In some areas we've got some remnants of lowland raised bog, some of the largest in the southwest, which we have at Shapwick Heath and at West Moor.
But in the case of Somerset here, at the end of the last ice age, about 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, we had glaciers. The glaciers melted, and as they melted, they left behind these big, wide, clay-lined valleys. And over the next kind of centuries and millennia and things, we had sort of sea waters kind of sort of washing in, and we had these wonderful kind of reedy kind of swamps, the beginnings of the peatland kind of forming. And obviously as the reeds kind of grew, natural succession, plants get to a certain age and then they die, and they fell into the dead plants fell into the waterlogged conditions underneath, and those waterlogged conditions stopped the anaerobic decomposition decay processes from happening. So basically there are layers of this organic matter, the dead plant matter, stored in the peatland, and over the centuries and the millennia that followed, we've got layers and layers and layers and layers of peat.
What's the difference between a bog and a fen then?
So basically a fen is fed by surface water and groundwater and can tolerate a lot of nutrients and quite a range in pH, but generally tends to be more alkaline, so it has like a higher pH. Bogs, on the other hand, are entirely rain-fed, so they have acidic inputs slightly acidic from the rainfall, and very low nutrient as well. So you get a lot of low-growing vegetation like the sphagnum mosses, or more so than sphagnum mosses, and the sundews and asphodel and things like that.
In the bog itself, we have some of the amazing sphagnum mosses in the Avalon Marshes on West Moor, and Shapwick Heath. We have maybe about 12 of the species that you might find in the UK, and they're amazing. They help shape the bog. They absorb water, so they help to keep it wet. They provide like a protective kind of layer, even when it's kind of a bit dry and hasn't rained for a while like it has this year. It kind of helps protect the surface of the peat and provides a protective layer. It also helps, peat bogs are meant to be acidic with the rainfall inputs that they have, and the sphagnum actually helps to regulate the acidity of the bog around it, which is amazing. You get the insectivorous sundew, so we've got round leaf sundew and the oblong leaf sundew in the area, and they're cool again because they supplement their diets by catching insects, because otherwise it's a very low nutrient input otherwise. You know, everyone loves to see a sundew. You know, they're like little alien kind of things, and then you see these like little flower spikes coming out in May, June time. It's amazing. And then you've got the cotton grasses and all sorts. So there's all sorts of amazing plant life that we have around here. And then we get things like the large marsh grasshopper, which we think went extinct in Somerset or thereabouts in the 1990s, and then actually come back again. Here on the Avalon Marshes, a lot of the landscape has been shaped by historic digging for compost. There's a lot of drainage features out there as well. So there are lots of fields with wet hedgerows instead of like normal hedgerows made of hedges and bushes and trees and things. We have a lot of wet ditches, and that those help keep the livestock in, provide them with water as well, and separate out people's land.
I didn't know a lot about birds and wildlife before I started working here, but actually I walk through there to see different birds every day that I've never seen before, and if you spend time in that sort of landscape, that there's not very many people there, it's very sort of natural, you're surrounded by the wildlife and those sounds rather than the sounds of daily life and the world that we know. They're very calming and relaxing.
Well, there's always the wonderful kind of swishing of the wind through the reeds, and especially if you're walking through the grasses as well. If you come in March, April time, you can hear the male bitterns booming, and there are lots of kind of sort of natural bird noises and all the rest of it. The colours and the sights and the sounds you'll see, everything, despite the very, very dry spring, is still looking reasonably green. But we have lots of sort of fenny kind of taller reeds and rushes and bulrushes growing around and about.
I like the Somerset Levels because of its unique environment for all sorts of wildlife, which I enjoy. I like the feel of antiquity and history, peace and tranquility of the wetlands within it.
I can feel the stress leaving me when I'm there. I'm quite often struck when I'm walking on the marshes just how big the sky is, how much landscape you've got to look at, and the incredible diversity of creatures that are in it.
It's just the excitement, and are you going to find a squelchy bit or not? It's always the excitement and the cool bird sightings and things that people see.
The story of the landscape here with humans is really where we see it massively changing. So it was very stable for a long time. It was just fluctuating depending on the environment. And about 10,000 to 6,000 years ago, that's when people started turning up here and really started using the landscape. So we have these little settlements on these islands that people were living, and they were creating trackways through these watery landscapes to get to the high grounds, basically. They didn't have roads to use, so they either went by canoes, so they would hollow out logs and use them as canoes, or they would create these trackways. And one of the great things that we've got here is because it's all peat, those trackways were buried and preserved. So one of the most interesting things that we have on the reserve from an archaeological point of view is the Sweet Track. And this is actually a wooden trackway that was built by people during the Neolithic period. And essentially it was a raised wooden trackway that went across the watery marshes, and it linked the settlement areas that were on the higher ground that stayed dry. And yes, so it goes for about 2 kilometres, and people were using it really for transportation. So for actually getting from A to B, for getting between the different settlements, trading with people, but also hunting. So they'd be shooting bows and arrows into the sky and actually sort of getting the wading birds and things like that as well.
A lot of people, they love the Avalon Marshes Centre, they love coming to visit. There's a lot of people locally who volunteer and are, specialists in a kind of grasshopper or a type of plant. But yeah, there are a lot of people who are supportive and a lot of people who actually aren't actually that aware yet. So through these things like Peat-Fest, it's a great opportunity to kind of reach out and try and explain a bit more about actually what the Avalon Marshes is, how we've got to where we are and all the rest of it.
Flooding will always be present here in the rainy times and should always naturally be so, as it is a special natural habitat, holding lots of water and preventing flooding in other areas.
Centuries ago, my ancestors tried to shape this land, change the course of the Parrot and the Brew, build their banks and edges higher than the hedges, pump water from the wetlands to grow maize fields and milk yields, peel back the soil to reveal the decomposing teeth of bare peat, now belching out enough carbon to swallow the sky.
Yeah, so you've got all these little different layers of over time of different settlements coming in and different ways of managing the land. A lot of the wetlands here are essentially man-made. We've extracted all the peat out, left huge holes. That's been filled in with water, and we've created this landscape. They certainly knew a lot in the past about how to manage the water levels and how to move water around the landscape. So a lot of the ditches and the sort of reens around here that we see that have been man-made to sort of move the water around. But yeah, on the big scale, sort of looking at it just on the surface, it's really obvious, like when you look at it, what's happened here, basically.
We kind of go from one extreme where there's water everywhere, and then this year we've got to the extent where it hasn't rained for so long.
And basically over time, some of that water was drained away, some of it by man-made sort of reasons, drainage for agriculture, but also climate change has contributed to it as well. So now we've got this landscape where we've got low-lying areas which flood very easily during the winter. The water levels rise quite quickly, and in the summer the challenge is to keep it wet, actually, because the water does also drain away very quickly as we're here.
If you go back 200 years, back to Roman times, actually, they first started draining the landscape to use the peat as a fuel source to make salt. And then ever since then it's been drained. The monks from Glastonbury diverted the River Brew, or maybe not the monks, but their serfs certainly did. And then, I don't know, 200-300 years ago, they really started with the Enclosures Act to basically allocate everyone a plot of land which was separated out by ditches. And they really started reclaiming the land then, where they had sort of high tech for the time, but sort of drainage pumps that could really kind of hoof the water out of the bogs and off of the fens and everything to create sort of a drier landscape that people could farm in, could live in, and all the rest of it. So, and ever since those times, obviously farms and businesses and towns and villages have, kind of become a part of this landscape. But there is a reason why it's called Somerset. It's the land of the summer people. So, of course, in the winter, it's generally too wet to have the livestock out on the land. So the summer is really kind of sort of when the farming and everything is in full swing down here with the haymaking and all the rest of it. It's pretty cool. So there's always been a certain degree of peat usage for fuel. Peat was being cut on West Hay Moor, which is one of our restoration sites here, up until about 1917, and then presumably with the First World War, people were drafted off either to go to the army or the forces or, into the land efforts and everything.
For a lot of people, the loss of peat cutting is worse than the loss of the environment almost, and the sort of climate change and the damage that is caused by it.
The landscape is changing, whether we want it to or not. We've had two very extreme years. It's one of the driest spring and summer seasons in 60 or so years this year, and then last year we had one of the wettest Februaries ever, with 3 times the amount of rainfall falling in the Axbridge catchment. It's, and that change and that variability is not something that really used to happen, certainly not back to back. On the peat bogs, we and everyone else in the area were underwater to levels that actually we'd never seen. There were, sizable sized fish and eels swimming over paths that were over welly depth in water. Where, now this year they are high and dry in comparison. So we do have an issue with nutrients on the Somerset levels and moors. So there's obviously a bit of a concern about, sort of high nutrients water washing in over a peat bog, which should have low nutrient sort of acidic water on it. But there's so much water about, there's nothing you can do in those instances, And obviously in the reverse, the completely dry sides that we've had since, on some of our sites, we've done this deep trench bunding technique, which is aimed at holding the water on the peatland for longer and slowing the flow. They say it takes 2 to 3 years for the peat to get its sponge-like qualities back. So although it's still very early days, we are hopeful that the water has stayed in the peat for longer than it would have done, and actually in the fullness of time it will make it more resilient to these swings in the weather conditions that we've experienced recently. In the Avalon Marshes area in particular, we have a lot of the nature reserves are based on old peat voids, and basically what they do is they get a digger and they dig the peat all the way out of the ground, all the way down 2, 3, 4 metres to the underlying clay. And they have these big kind of scars in the landscape, which are then kind of relined with clay and then sold off, sometimes to nature organisations like the Wildlife Trust and the RSPB. Some people buy them up and use them as fishing lakes. But they do take a long time to restore for nature.
Here in Somerset, where I live now, we know the water's coming. We are climate canaries, ever-changing, writhing eels, waiting for the day of mass migration, when our childhood playground will rise up to reclaim the summer lands which we have borrowed from the sea. Every winter, to remind us, the sky falls down, to paint the fields with its reflection, a mirror for the moon to check her smiling, before she blows a wobbly kiss up the Bristol Channel to the shore, into the plastic playground at Atlanta's door. Yes, we are all waiting for Poseidon's knock. We are a world waiting, with our hearts and sandbags breaking.
The restoration of peat in this area will help to reduce extreme flooding.
There's a fair amount happening, and effort happening and going in, but there's still a lot of people out there who don't actually really know what peat is and the value of it when it comes to both biodiversity and climate change. And there's been a lot of dedication and decades of hard work by the charities and by the volunteers just to kind of build the Avalon Marshes up to be what it is today.
So that peat restoration projects that we're doing is really trying to come up with a technique that would work to try and reinvigorate that old peat that is still there and help it to create a better sort of landscape. It obviously takes thousands of years for peat to develop, but in order to do it, it needs to have the right conditions. So what we're doing here is we've got targeted areas of old peat extraction sites where basically all the good peat's been taken out, and what we're left with is really bad, degraded peat that is really not very good. And what we're doing is splitting up these fields into square cells, essentially, and digging down, essentially down to the natural, and turning it all over. So all the good peat that's left down below gets brought up and mixed up, and that bad peat gets sort of mixed into it.
The first thing we had to tackle was this overgrown vegetation, a lot of scrub sort of dominating the area. So we came in and mulched it all down to just sort of get us back to a blank surface, if you like, a blank page. So in mulching all the vegetation down to the surface, it then means that any increase in water table, which I'll come on to next, will just drown out any of the roots that are left of the sort of more dry loving species, and the bog species that were there will come back absolutely fine. And with peatlands, you've always got to think about the hydrology before you think about the habitat, because if you start trying to introduce plants by planting or just removing scrub and hoping things will come back, but you haven't got the hydrology right, so you haven't got that water table sort of in the right spot, the plants we don't want will continue to thrive, and the plants we do want will struggle to get away. So we use the peat that's here, you get an excavator in, they remove the turf sort of in one piece, put it to one side, and then using the good quality sort of sticky squishy peat that's below the ground still, so once you get through that degraded layer, you use the squishy peat to build up this bund. And what you do is you scoop it up with a bucket and you flip it over and you just squish it down. So you're building this seal all the way up through those cracks, sealing up all the cracks. We do it in this cell sort of arrangement so that you're blocking up the cracks at lots of intervals throughout the peatland, because if you only did it around the outside, there would still be a whole bit in the middle that the water would kind of be free moving across, which then means when it rains, water hits the surface, instead of disappearing through the cracks and out and away, it hits the surface and, you know, will percolate down through the peat, but then it will come up against this bund and get pushed back to the surface. So the water is held within each cell. This area held water within the bunds for months longer than it did pre-restoration in similar drought conditions. Does that make sense? So we're seeing lots of positive signs, even though right now it's pretty dry. And we are seeing sphagnum moss sort of recolonising. So the sphagnum moss, which is the key thing for these habitats, can tolerate a certain level of drought. So even though this is not ideal, come winter when it starts raining again, fingers crossed, the moss will come back to life.
The restoration sites that we do have, we have already seen species return that we haven't seen here for a long time. They haven't been recorded for the last 20 years, for example, and now we're seeing them again. So particularly plant species that have disappeared from the levels are starting to return to those specific areas, and certain types of birds which need that sort of thing for ground nesting in particular, we're starting to see them return as well. So positive signs so far that it's working, but it is quite a controversial subject locally. So because flooding has such a devastating impact on the area, a lot of people actually see peat restoration as a way of making the marshes wetter and therefore make flooding more likely as opposed to less likely. So one of the things that we're always trying to do as a partnership, but particularly going forwards, is trying to sort of help people understand what peat is, how good it is for the environment, how it will actually help with the flooding issues that we're having rather than causing them.
We're at a bog garden that's just beginning to be constructed. How have you done it?
Yeah, so what we were trying to do was create a little mini raised bog garden in the Avalon Marshes Visitor Centre picnic area, so people who can't get out onto the reserves for whatever reason would get an opportunity to see what a bog garden looks like. So basically what we've got is one of our volunteers has very kindly donated a plastic pond former like you would put in your garden, and we have filled it full of peat-free ericaceous compost rather than actual peat. And what we're doing at our event on Saturday is we're getting members of the public to come in and help us plant it up. So we've brought trays and trays of sphagnum mosses and sedges and various different grasses, a few sundews even. So what we're hoping is everyone will be able to get hands-on and really get up close with the different sorts of flora that you would find in a peat bog and sort of get the experience of creating one for themselves.
There's a whole range of activities and days that are being run by various members of the Avalon Marshes Partnership. We have young warden days or youth experience days, which actually get young people out onto the reserves and experience what it's like, and they learn as they're there and understand what wetlands are and how the history of the landscape has kind of created the reserves that we have today. We have this wonderful Peat-Fest event, which we're really looking forward to, with our storytellers and obviously the mossy carpets and all sorts of interesting bits and pieces, as well as our restoration walks and talks that we do. We're trying to turn the tide, and we hope that we've been successful in keeping peatlands as they should be and the carbon out of the atmosphere.
We have reached the end of Wetland, our second Bogcast episode. Thank you for coming ground gazing with us and discovering the wonderful world beneath. We look forward to seeing you next time for a Bogcast in which we will be enveloped in timeless darkness as we sink beneath to explore strange and fascinating underworlds. This episode featured extracts from When You Know the Water's Coming, a poem by Liv Talk, co-director of Hot Poets, a climate science and poetry organisation. Thank you to them for their amazing work. We feel privileged to have been able to make this podcast with funding from the Heritage Lottery Fund. Special thanks to everyone who spoke to us and helped make this happen, to the Art and Energy Collective and RE-PEAT, to all the other wonderful organisations involved, including South-West Peatland Partnership, Dorset Peatland Partnership, the Avalon Marshes Partnership, the National Trust, RSPB, Wildlife Trusts, Dartmoor and Exmoor National Parks, Planet Purbeck, Cornwall National Landscape Team, and thank you to Otis Jordan for the beautiful music you heard, and of course to you for listening.